Hey everyone, in this tutorial we'll go over how to light and shade this scene. I'll show you how to achieve interesting lighting without making it too complicated, how to create Gobos procedurally, how to link lights in Octane, and how to create AOVs. Once all that is done, we'll bring it over to Davinci Resolve and Fusion to do some post-processing on it, color correct it a bit, and then export the final video. Let's set this thing in motion. Okay, so before we do anything, we're just gonna put down a null and hook all of our hero objects to it. Let me actually resize this. And we can just use this nully to reposition our object. I don't want it to be facing us head on, so I'm gonna add or like rotate it by 20 degrees, negative 20 degrees in the x-axis and positive 25 degrees in the y-axis, so that it's pointing up towards this upper right corner. And we're also going to want to move it a bit closer to the camera. Something like 0.6 in the Z should work. So I use this plugin or like toolset called OD Tools. I can definitely recommend it as it has a ton of perks. One of them is that you can just press Shift Tab and it plops down this Octane quick setup, which has everything in it that we need to render or like start rendering. So yeah, if you have OD Tools, just do that. If you don't, we're gonna have to head into the Octane shelf, which is here. If you don't have this shelf, simply click on the plus, go to shelves, and just click on Octane. After that, we're gonna want to create our Octane ROP and our render target. Actually, I'm gonna delete this old ROP here. Okay. I don't know why Octane makes it so tedious. It doesn't really make too much sense to me, but yeah, that's just what we're gonna have to do. And because we have to hop around a little bit, I will just start creating some shortcuts. So if we press Ctrl 1 here, we can set a quick mark for our OBJ level. Ctrl 2, we set a quick mark for our material level. And Ctrl 3 brings us to the ROP. Now that that is done, we can get started with some settings in our render target. So press 2, here we are. Octane's default rendering kernel is set to direct lighting, which we do not want. So let's put that to path tracing. We're also going to want to use an HDRI, so we need to change the environment from daylight to texture. In the PT kernel tab here, we also want to decrease our max samples to something like 512. We're going to increase this later on, but for previewing and stuff, this is good. And our GI clamp is way too high. So let's set that to 5. Something between like 5 to 10 usually works out. If you want to learn more about the nitty-gritty of Octane, I can definitely recommend Raphael Rau's YouTube channel. I'll also link him below. This is all for the PT kernel now. We'll come back to it towards the end of the tutorial. Let's hop into this text environment tab and add an HDRI of our liking to it. I'm using Maxime Roz's HDRIs. I'll put the link into the description. He has both paid and free ones, which I can 100% recommend. For this setup, we want to use the HDRI Canada Montreal PR Kitchen. It's just some dude's kitchen. So we can just drag it in here. And we're going to want to enable the reflections and the refractions. And we're done with this render target for now. We're ready to create some simple materials. To start off, we're just gonna create an Octane material builder, dive in there and delete the standard material and replace it with a universal material. I like to use the universal material because oftentimes I use the Octane medium and this workflow just works well for me. Do it as you wish. So we can just hop back out again. And now we can copy paste this here multiple times. We need 3 materials for the balls, so transparent, red, and blue. Then we're gonna need 4 for the inside, so liquids, gels, grains, and the air bubbles. And we need 2, one for a gobo and one for a backdrop. Let's give these guys some names. So transparent, red, and blue, oops, liquid, grains, gel, air bubbles, backdrop, and gobo. We can also start assigning these materials now. So we just press 1 to get back out here. Dive in there, add a material. This here will simply be our gel material. We can just copy paste this. Go to the air bubbles. Give it the air bubble material. Go into our grains. Actually, our grains are kind of an edge case because they're packed geometry. So for our grains, you need to go back to the setup over here to the Vellum grains. Just add the material over here. Grains. Now for the balls we need to use the different groups that we created earlier on, but we also need to promote these groups. So let's put down a group promote. And we want to promote the red group to primitives. So group red and group blue. Just like that. And now what we can do is we can simply say, okay, take this transparent material, apply to everything, but then afterwards, apply the red material to the red group and the blue material to the blue group. Where is blue? There is blue. Okay. Then we're gonna want to go to our fluids, add another material. This here will be liquid. And that should be it for now. Actually, no, I forgot one more thing. So in our grains over here, we're gonna have to go into Octane, go into, where is it? Was it particles, properties? Ah, here. Under properties, we need to activate packed geo instancing. Okay, so there are two things missing now. One is our backdrop and the other is the gobo. Let's get started with the backdrop first. We're just gonna put down a box. Then we can scale this here up by 1.5 and 1.5 on the X and Y, and up the uniform scale to 15. Next, we're gonna want to UV unwrap this. And then we can simply select, oops, this front and top face, and we can blast it. Now we reverse the faces and subdivide it to get it nice and smooth. Let's put this to a depth of 6. Now it looks like this. However, we don't want it to be like super duper round, so we can override this crease weight attribute, set this to 2, and it looks kinda box-ish. Then lastly, we're just gonna add our material. Go here, backdrop, there we go. Just put down an alt null, just for sake of being neat. And now we can also name this here render backdrop and color it red. So what does this actually look like now? Let's actually take a look. We can click on this IPR button here to open up our Octane IPR, and it looks okay, I guess. We have some we have the ambient light, or like the lighting in general from the HDRI, but I would like to have a key light in here. So let's put down a Octane light. We can up the efficiency a little bit. And I want to create a sort of mini rig. So I want to have this here to be my X rotation and this here to be my Y rotation. And I want the Y to be around 45 degrees. Close this so we can actually see. And this here to be negative 45 degrees. So now it's pointing upwards. And then I would like to just move this light here back by like 15 roughly, or maybe even 18. Let's take a look at what my notes say. Yeah, 18 it is. So yeah, if we click on the IPR again now, we'll see that we have some, like this key light from here. Okay, cool. However, this still looks very boring, which is where the gobo comes into play. So one quite simple way to create a gobo is to just have a plane. So we're gonna create a grid. Then we can actually immediately connect this grid to our rig here. Dive in. Let's decrease the rows to 2. Then we can UV flatten this. just to give it some UVs. Next up, we're gonna want to reverse this. And then we just add the material to it, which the material here would be Gobo. And last but not least, we'll just create a null, call this here render Gobo. And if we go out here, I'll also just say render Gobo and make it red. If we were to render this now, it would look really bad because the Gobo is like in the middle here. So what we want to do is, oh, actually 1 second. We also need to change this orientation here to XY. Almost forgot. We can just like move this Gobo here up. Let's put it to like 10. And if we look at the renderer or the IPR now, oh shoot, it should not look like this for you. It's because I already went dead with the material. Let's just delete this here. So now we see that this light here, it's being almost completely blocked. And in order to get this like nice interplay between light and shadows, we're gonna need to create a material for the Gobo. And then like what we're basically going to want to do is we want to use the Cinema 4D noise, and we want to map those black and white values to the opacity of the material. So first of all, let's just make this material here all black. Take down the specular. Then we're gonna want to add a Cinema 4D noise. I like to use this noise here just because I'm used to it from Redshift, and I quite like this blister turbulence. So if you plug this in like this, nothing too much happens because it's quite grayish. If we are to zoom out here, oh, that's kind of freaky. We can see that like it's like half transparent, but like it's not really doing what we want. So like it's not really blocking the light. So in order to do that, we can simply add a tool gradient in here, which we can then use to kind of tighten in those values. So if we just take this here, you can see, okay, gets a lot more transparent. Pull this in here, we see, okay, the black parts are starting to get like really black. Just put this here to 0.47, this here to, 0.45 and 0.47. And if we now reset this, reset the view here, you can see, okay, there's like a little bit of like shadow happening here, a little bit of light. However, I think that our HDRI is still providing a little bit too much light. So we're going to change that later. But first of all, I would like to make this, like, give it some light streaks from above here. Just like the sun back in school days. So in order to do that, we just put down this transform here, put the scale here to 2 and 0.3. Let's actually dial down the HDRI so that we can see it a little bit better. So if we go here into the text environment, put this here to 0.15. Now we can see it. So now we have like the streaks of light happening here. Let's also translate this here, maybe a little bit like that, and add some rotation to it. And now this looks nice. One last thing that I also did, or that I tend to do, Linus Zoll actually gave me that tip, is to just use like light textures. So we can go here, use distribution IES texture, and I have this IES texture of like a spotlight here, which unfortunately I cannot share with you, but there's plenty of them online, so shouldn't have too much trouble finding one. Yeah, so I'll put this in here. Now we can see, oh my god, it is way too bright. So what do we need to do? We need to reduce the power here. Okay, and I would also like to make this light here a little bit warmer, although maybe this is a little bit too warm now. Let's maybe go to 6000. Although actually no, I quite liked it when it was very warm. So there's one last thing that we want to do, which is we want to give the backdrop a different light, kind of like we want to basically link the light. So we have one light only for the backdrop and one light only for the hero object. And it's quite easy to do in Octane. We just need to give this light here a light pass ID. Let's just say this is light pass ID 2. And let's call this here hero, oops, hero key light. Now we just copy paste this here. Call this here backdrop and give this here the ID of 1. So now if we click on a backdrop here, can actually go, make this here a little bit bigger, to the light path mask, and we can say, okay, do not be affected by light path number 2. Let's reload. And if we turn this here off now, we see that our backdrop light is still affecting all of our hero objects. So let's select all of those, go into Octane, light path mask, and say, hey, light path 1 is not for you. Cool. So now we can kind of crispen up those shadows by making our light source a little bit smaller. So 0.6, 0.6, 0.6. And now we can see it looks like a bit more dramatic. Let's turn this light here back on. And yeah, one last thing. Let's also say that the backdrop shouldn't be affected by the environment. Cool. So this is basically our lighting done for the scene. So now we can move on to creating the materials. Okay, one last thing that we need to do is we need to turn off the camera visibility and shadow visibility on these lights. Okay, so our materials for the transparent balls, it's fairly straightforward. Just gonna go in here. We want to put this here to thin wall. Then we want to turn on the albedo here and add a RGB, color RGB to the transmission. We'll just make this here a white. And then we will activate fake shadows. Okay, and last but not least, we're gonna set the IOR to that of plastic and add a little bit of roughness to them. And that's it. Okay, for this red suede material, I just took this like regular material here, put it on diffuse, and I reduced the IOR. Then I used a RGB color to plug it into the albedo, made it 0.300, just a value that worked for me. And here comes the magic. So what I really like is this sheen. So if you just give this sheener a color, we can see that like it's just gonna create this like satiny look based on, I think, the Fresnel. And yeah, it's just great for stuff like this here. Now you can go like all overboard with this, but it doesn't really look realistic. So what I did is I duplicated this here, made it a little bit brighter. It was 0.75, oops, 0.45, 0.45. Plug that in here. Sheen color. And then I drive the roughness with a texture. So the texture that I use is by Texture Supply. It's one of the fabric textures. It's really good. They have a Patreon where you get access to like certain textures for like a very small amount of money. So yeah, I can totally recommend that. And another person that I can recommend is Travis Davids. It's this guy here. Let me just move this here to the other monitor. So this mega bundle, it's amazing value. And same with this like ultimate pack here. Actually, I don't even know if like these contain the same stuff. But yeah, overall, his stuff is just superb. I use it every day almost. Okay, so I'm not sponsored, by the way. Yeah, so let's just plug this texture here into the sheen roughness. And it doesn't really do too much, which is because we need to clamp this here a little bit. So let's add our tool gradient again. Then we're gonna want to just pull this here all the way down. Something like this. Actually, no, let's invert this. Put the white here. Move the black down here. Yes, and that looks very nice in my opinion already. Maybe we'll put this to 0.6. And we're gonna want to scale this texture a little bit. So just put down this transform here, plug it in here, go 0.75, 0.75. And there we have it. That's it. Now we can just take the same texture here, plug it in here for the bump, and maybe decrease the power just a tiny bit to like 0.25. And that's the suede texture. The texture for the blue balls, or like the blue fabric, is also fairly straightforward. So what we're just gonna do is we're just gonna put this here to diffuse again. Where is it? Diffuse. Then I'm just gonna want to add another RGB, color RGB, into the albedo here. Then I just made this here a blue color, so it was like this and like this. Again, you can just click on here, like figure the stuff out. I'm just typing in the values right now. Then we're gonna want to add some like fingerprint texture on here for the roughness. So I just took this fingerprint texture from Travis David's and I used a tool gradient to clamp it a little bit, or like, yeah, to just kind of make it less extreme, I guess, in this case. So here we go into the roughness. Put this here to 0.25. And that looked pretty nice already. And then for the last thing that I did is I added a bump texture where I used this weave texture, also by Travis David's, I think. So if you just put this in here, we see that we have this, it's like weaving here. However, it's a little bit too like big. So I just use the transform here, put this here to 0.1 and 0.1. And then it looked like this, which, yeah, already looks quite nice. We could maybe even make it a little bit smaller, like 0.05, 0.05. And I would also decrease the power a little bit. Actually, no, the power is already quite decreased. Actually, maybe a little bit more. Cool. So that's the blue material. Now we can move on to the liquid. For the liquid, I used the regular specular material, gave it a little bit of roughness, and I changed the IOR to 1.33. Next up, I added a color RGB again. And then I picked out this orange color. Let's plug this here into transmission. Let's also change the albedo here to black. And the color was like 1.415 and 0. And gave us this orange color here. I turned on fake shadows and I added some random walk subsurface scattering. So if you just go here, random walk, put this here into medium, decrease the density to 2. And then I increase the albedo to 1. And I decrease the radius a little bit to 0.75. And that was it. So the grain balls are also super simple. Just hop in here to the gray material. I set this here to diffuse thin walled. So thin wall diffuse. Set this albedo here to black. Then I created a color RGB. Then I gave this here like a light blue color, like very, very, very light blue. 0.75, 0.94, and 1. So it looked like this. And then I also added some roughness, 0.25 again. And I changed the IOR to plastic. And also activate fake shadows here. The gel material, again, super simple. Just put this albedo here to black. Then I put the roughness down to 0, gave it an IOR of 1.33, same as water. And I added this color RGB here with pure white. Connected it to this transmission. Let's reload. Cool. Set this here back to 0. And then I just activated fake shadows. And that was it. And last but not least, the air bubbles. It's the same thing again. It's just no roughness, 1.33 IOR. Make it black. And then add this color RGB with pure white. Now if we just reload this, we can see that all of our materials work. However, our scene is a little bit too dark, which we're gonna fix in the next step. Okay, so I finally know why our scene is so incredibly dark. So what we need to do at first is to remove this IES texture from our backdrop light. And then we're gonna fix the power a little bit. Let's try 101. A little bit too dark. 106, that works. So that was the first issue. And then the second issue is that we need to work on some color management. OD tools kind of does everything for you and like makes it very easy, which is why I forgot to do it here. So without further ado, let's go into our Octane drop here. Then we're gonna want to set this color space here to OCIO and a color space roll to ACG. And if we reload this here already, haha, it is bright. We can actually see things now. Great. And while we're here, we can actually also change some other stuff. So we want to change our EXR compression. I like to use DWAB for this type of animation. Again, if you want to learn more about all of the technicalities of it, I can only recommend Raphael Rau's YouTube channel. I'll link it in the description, as I've probably already said multiple times. And we're also going to want to just turn off the depth of field in for disk rendering. And we also want to activate the motion blur. So let's enable the formation motion blur, instance, and particles. Now we can simply hop over to our render target, change some settings there too. So in the PT kernel, we want to increase our max samples to 2048. Then under the sampling tab here, we can increase our parallel samples. I'll just double these here. This depends on like how strong your computer is kind of. You can read up the details about it in the documentation. I usually just set it to 32 and 64. And we can also activate adaptive sampling. So let's put this noise threshold here to 0.01. And then there's one last thing, which is in the imager tab. We want to put our hot pixel removal to 0.6, just to kind of counteract some fireflies in there. Last but not least, we also want to create some AOVs. So this step is not super necessary if you want to do something like depth of field or motion blur directly in camera. But I've been wanting to learn some new things and like learn more about post-processing and doing DOF and motion blur in post. So I use the AOVs here. It's very simple. We just click on info here, activate our motion vectors, activate our Z depth. I found that a Z depth of 20 worked fairly well. We can check this here by actually right-clicking on this, viewing the Z depth path. Now we can see we have this like grayscale map. And if we look at the motion vectors, this also works. So that's actually it for the whole setup here. We can now just go back to our ROP again, set up our output settings here. Actually, where is it again? We want to render the frame range. Here we go. So it's going to be $hip. So it's the folder where your hip is in. $render, $hip name. Then $os means the name of the SOP, or like the name of the ROP here. And $f4. And it's going to be saved as an EXR, which is fine. So what you can just do now is render to disk. And then I'll see you in Fusion in the next tutorial. Actually, I meant in the next part of this tutorial. No worries. Okay, so here in Resolve, we first of all want to import our sequence. I just have it right here. You can just find it wherever you rendered it to. Then we want to go into our edit screen, create a new timeline. Please ignore this here. This is the old timeline. Let's just call this here Torus V001. We don't want to use the project settings because we want to actually set this here to 1080 by 1080. 24 frames is fine. So now we can, drag our footage in here. We can just set our out point over here, in and out. There we go. You can do that by pressing I and O on your keyboard. And now we can dive into Fusion. This will by no means be a Fusion masterclass, just FYI. I'll just quickly walk you through what I did for this project. So now that we have our media in here, if we press 1, we can take a look at it in our first viewer. We can just copy paste this here 2 times. Copy paste, get rid of these merges. Because we need our motion vector, we need our beauty and our z depth y. If we preview this here, great. So let's put our beauty paths in here. And let's first of all deal with changing the color here, or like the color space from ACES to Rec 709. The way we do that is with a OCIO color space. This menu that I just opened, you can open it by pressing Shift space or Control space. Let's grab this here, this one into here, and this one into here. Now we just need to grab our OCIO config. I use ACES 1.2. Our source space is ACES CG, and our output space is a Rec 709. Now we can see, okay, in comparison to this one here, it looks better. Like the colors are kind of correct now. So now that we have our media in dealt with, or like our beauty paths dealt with, we can deal with our motion vectors. So for our motion vectors, we need a motion or vector motion blur. Then the yellow one here is our input, which is a beauty path. And the green one is our vectors. Now if we connect this guy here, then we can simply say the X channel should be the red and the Y channel should be the green. And if we just zoom in here now a little bit, yeah, we can see it like very, yeah, it's a little bit difficult to see here. If I just put this to 100, then we can see like there is like some motion blur happening here. But yeah, I found the value of 3 pretty good. So that's actually our motion blur done already. So for our depth of field, we're gonna have to do a little bit of prep work. So if we just go here, put down a vary blur, then we're just gonna connect this guy. Actually, no, not yet. We need to do the prep work first. So let's put down a brightness contrast. Because right now, if we look at this here, it's all like very grayish. It doesn't have like the contrast kind of. So if we just plug this in here now and we take a look at it. Oops, not like this. We do need this guy here for our regular input. And then I believe it was like this. And if we now say that the blur channel here should be set to Luma, put the quality up and increase the blur size, we can see that like it's blurring like everything kinda. It's it doesn't have like it's not crisp enough for my taste kinda. I don't know how else to describe it. So in order to combat that, we can simply plug this here into a brightness contrast first and then into here. And we can make this mask here a little bit like crisper, like a little bit more contrasty. So what worked for me was a gamma of 0.7. And then changing this low point here to 0.15 and a high point to 0.5. Okay. And then I also just, actually no, this here doesn't make any difference. Okay. So now if I look here and I change this vary blur to be like only 1 maybe. That looks pretty nice already. Okay, so this would be our whole like post-processing done so far. The next thing would be to just adjust the color a little bit. So what I did for that is I just took this color curve here, pulled it up a little bit, and that was it. So the last step would then be to export our footage. For that, we can simply go into Deliver. Then our in and out points are already set. So we can just give it a file name. Let's just say Torus tutorial done, yay, or something like that. Format MP4, codec H.264 is okay. Resolution is also still set. I can add this here to render queue. Let me delete all of these guys here. And then we can simply click render all and it'll pretty much be done. Like it's just gonna render it out. And you have your finished render lying around somewhere on your hard drive, wherever you put that location. Thanks for following along. If you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe, share it on your socials. You know the deal. I would also be very grateful if you'd comment on how I could improve these tutorials. Feel free to also tag me in your creations. I'd love to see what you make.